I've worked on cases with many of you, so a lot of the things that I talk about today will actually be pretty familiar to you. And I know we've got several counties represented here, but how many of you do handle personal injury cases, for instance, from time to time? If you open the phone book, and I'm in Tuscaloosa, we've got probably 400 plus lawyers. People come there and they don't leave. We've really got too many lawyers for our community, I think. But if you look in the personal injury section, everybody's a personal injury lawyer, which is fine. And I think the reason that is because if you practice law, eventually somebody's going to come to you and say, I had my cousin got in a car accident, or somebody in my Sunday school class got involved in an accident, and you're there called upon to be the lawyer, which is a very obviously important role. And so over the last 10 years of seeing that, I've noticed something that's happened. And it started off with me, and that was when somebody would come to me, I'd say, yeah, I'll help you out, see what I can do. And I'd sit back thinking, this one seems to be pretty clear-cut to me. I mean, I've looked at the police report. It either says you're at fault, or it says you're not at fault. And if you're not at fault, I thought, well, this ought to be pretty straightforward, because if you're not at fault, that means, look, they've got insurance. So that means, hey, we're in a really good position. They're at fault. We got insurance. You're telling me you're injured. I got your records. It took 3 months to get in. This ought to be pretty straightforward. And then I would just run into a wall. I just don't understand what's going on here. I can't get the adjuster to call me back. And when they do, they tell me they haven't reviewed the file yet. And then they tell me they've looked at the report and there's issues with my client. And then when the police report says my client's fault, they say, yeah, you need to look at that police report. And then when I start thinking we're making progress, they tell me they got to shift me over to a claims manager who needs 30 more days to review the claim. And next thing you know, it's 4 or 5 months into the claim, and I haven't even seen an offer. And I thought, this something's not right about this. What is taking place? And then I had the opportunity to meet a lawyer in Birmingham who I became friends with. And he shared something with me. And he said, you know what, I've just about had enough. He said there's a lot of good things that they're doing on the other side. But he said, and I've been doing it for a long time, but I finally had enough. He said, I just went to a seminar in Las Vegas where they were trying to figure out ways that they could buy time, insurance companies, buy time to put together a case against your client. And he said, it's really one of the most despicable things I've ever seen in my life. And he said, I finally had enough after 20 years. He said, I went to this seminar, and they encouraged us to pay for a funeral. For instance, it's a really bad wreck with a company vehicle, or it could be an 18-wheeler, or it could be an industrial-type accident. They said, you need to pay for the funeral. Well, that sounds good. I said, what's wrong with that? I would think that would be an honorable thing to do. Well, the reason you pay for a funeral sometimes is because you want to give the impression to the family that we're going to take care of you. And that'll buy you time. Because in the time that you've done that, we can then go behind the scenes to build a case in case we think there is something that we can defend on. And then 3 or 4 months down the road, the family says, okay, I got the impression that we were going to try to resolve this. Where are we? Well, our investigation has determined that it may have been your loved one's fault. And so we're not going to ask for the money back on the funeral. But that'll be the end of that. Now, what has happened during that 3 to 4 month period? What has your client done? Nothing. They haven't even talked to a lawyer yet. Or they've talked to you, and maybe you've said, like I have, well, it looks like they're going to do the right thing. So let's just give it some time. Let's gather the information we need. Let's let the dust settle. And then at the appropriate time, we'll get together and figure out what we can do to get this resolved. What I want to show today, and let me say, I mean this. I've said this before on some other presentations that we give, and inevitably some of them are shown on TV as part of what's called the People's Law School, and somebody will call in and they'll say, you're just dogging everybody on the other side. You're dogging the defense lawyers, you're dogging the truck drivers, and obviously I can say it 10 times during the presentation that there are some good people out there. There are good companies. There are good insurance agents. There are good insurance adjusters. There are good truck drivers. But it gets lost, I guess, in the rest that I say. So I'm going to preface it again. I know a lot of good lawyers on the other side. I do. I have dealt with companies that want to step up and do the right thing. I have dealt with companies who have looked at it and said, you know what, we genuinely believe your client did something wrong. But unfortunately, I've also noticed a trend that I want to show you today, because I think it's very important that if we're going to represent people, that we at least understand and appreciate the importance of working quickly. I know you probably got a little flavor of this from Co. I can't overstate the importance of evidence right after something happens. You know, there is really no legal requirement in Alabama for anybody to preserve evidence unless they are specifically asked to preserve evidence, and then there are other conditions made like, we'll agree to take the reasonable steps to preserve the evidence for you. There's absolutely no obligation in most every situation to preserve evidence. Well, why is that so important? I mean, why is it so important? Let me show you this. This is something that I was really surprised about. Let me show you what this is. I got what's called a company manual. Okay? Have you all heard of, did Co mention the black box? Y'all know when a plane crashes, the very first thing that anybody looks for is the black box, right? And there's a reason for that. I think we've got a member of law enforcement here today. And the reason is because there's just such critical evidence on that tells you what. What happened? You know, what did the pilot do? What did the pilot warn? What did the airplane do? Was there a mechanical defect? Matter of fact, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago that we finally got the report about the plane that crashed in the ocean to figure out exactly why that plane crashed. And it's amazing at the technology there. Well, you know, probably the vehicle that you're driving today has got similar type capabilities. And I guarantee you that if you drove down here today and you passed one tractor trailer, that it's got a black box. Did y'all know that? Now, there's a bunch of different words for them. They call them ECMs, electronic control modules, engine control modules. I call them a black box because many times they're black. And they capture data. And this paragraph here is a common paragraph that all trucking companies have in their corporate manuals. And that is, look, the data that is on our tractors, it can be used against us, it can be used to protect us, it can be used to help figure out what happened. Now, why do most trucking companies, for instance, have a black box on the tractor? So they can monitor the engine performance. Why? So they can see if their driver's taking care of the engine or not. Because in profit margin, they figured out if we get good drivers who take care of our equipment, then we can make more money. Well, most of these black boxes, though, also provide critical data that can explain how an accident happens. But you know that most tractors are also equipped with what I'm about to show you. You know what that is? You know what that was? There are now, this is amazing. In most tractors, there is a camera. There is a camera that's looking out onto the road, and there is a camera that's looking back on the driver. Now you figured out in that one that it wasn't the truck driver's fault, right? Truck driver's doing everything he's supposed to do. He's got both hands on the wheel. He's looking out the window. He's in his lane. And then out of nowhere, someone does cut over right in front of him. Well, if you're a lawyer and you're representing the family who comes into you and says, you know what, Aunt Betty was involved in a tractor-trailer wreck and we think it was a tractor-trailer's fault. You send off a letter to the insurance company, they send this back. Case is over. But how many times have you sent the letter and you genuinely believe that it was your client who was in the right and received that video? First time I received it was when my client was at fault. I've yet to receive it many times when it wasn't my client's fault. That is some critical data, but let me tell you what happens. That data, if it's not asked to be preserved, guess where it goes? It disappears. This next one here, this is just how important data can be to proving your case. And let me tell you, if it hadn't been for the collection of data within hours and days after the wreck, there was nothing that could have been made of this case. This was a typical type collision. Okay, and I'm going to explain this data in just a second. It is a typical type collision. Somebody ran a red light. It was either the truck driver or it was the other person in the passenger car. Well, you all know what typically happens, right? If there is a T-bone collision between a tractor trailer and an injured person, there's a good chance that the injured person is not going to live. Or if they do live, they're going to be seriously injured. To the point that by the time the troopers make it to the scene, many times the person in the passenger vehicle is either off to the morgue, off to the hospital. Officer doesn't get a great opportunity to speak to them about what happened. But who is there? And many times he or she's not injured because you got an 80,000-pound vehicle and a 4,000-pound vehicle. Many wrecks are not witnessed. So how could you possibly conclude in that type situation where there was no video camera, either of the intersection or on the vehicles, about who ran the red light? It'd be tough, wouldn't it? I mean, you'd have to rely upon people telling the truth, right? Well, guess what happened? In this particular incident, one person said, nope, I had the green light. The other person said, nope, I had the green light. Now, I figured out a long time ago that doesn't happen. I guess that's a technical possibility, but that does not happen. Yet, you know those black boxes that I told you about? Because I want to show you just how critical the information is. If a truck driver is driving that tractor and he gets on his brakes and the speed declines by 7 miles per hour in 1 second, it triggers what's called a hard braking event, which means the data from 45 seconds before the collision, or the hard braking event, and 30 seconds afterward is going to be captured. Well, that's pretty impressive, right? That tells you a lot. It tells you about speed, but you know what it also tells you? See this right column on the top? That is the one that's in yellow, where it says 0, 100, 100, 100, 0. I got a little excited. I thought the guy may have been going 100 miles per hour. That's not what that is. That is your acceleration. That is your RPMs. Now, that's the truck driver's data. There was a hard braking event, and in the 4 seconds before, there is 100% acceleration, which means the foot is on the pedal to the max. What do you think is happening there? Somebody's trying to beat a light, right? This data here at the bottom right is your sequences from that intersection on red light, yellow light, green light. Yellow light is 3.5 seconds long, which means in that situation, the truck driver, by the time he got into the intersection, he had a red light and was trying to beat the light in order to get through it. Now, that data disappears and disappears quickly. There is no obligation to preserve that data. There is no obligation to download that data. How could you possibly prosecute a case like this if you didn't get the data early? You couldn't. There's just no way that you could prosecute that case with any kind of success. Likewise, if that data is bad for your client, it's out there and it's something that you should know and something you should know early. Jim, you recognize that picture, don't you? To give you just one more example of some of the incredible data that's out there, and then I want to get into some things you got to really be careful about. Most tractors are now carrying a system called VORAD, V-O-R-A-D. most of the major fleets. You know what those lines are right there? This is really incredible. This is tracking every vehicle around you. If you're in the tractor and it senses a vehicle in front of you, it puts it on the screen. It starts graphing it. It designates a collar for it. It starts picking up how fast it's going. It recognizes how fast you're going. It recognizes the closing speeds. And if the closing speed reaches a certain point, then you start getting alarms in the tractor because you're following too closely. But you've also got vehicles to your right to warn you that you have a vehicle to your right. It gets its own collar. You've got a vehicle to your left. It's got its own collar. You've got a vehicle behind you. It's got its own color. All of this is designed to make the roads more safe. Well, this is the kind of data that's out there on many new modern trucks. So, this one actually happened, I hate to tell you, but right out, not far from right out here when you get on 231 as you go back to Ozark. In that particular case, truck driver just plowed into the back of a vehicle. And of course the defense was, the guy pulled out in front of us, or, he all of a sudden stopped. And it turns out the victim had been in front of the tractor for several minutes, and there was a closing speed, and the truck driver just kept closing in, never hit his brakes until about a half second before he hit the vehicle. Critical data. So what I want to examine now is something that will expose, I think, what is really happening after a wreck like this. When a driver is involved in a wreck, especially for a company vehicle, they often make two calls from the scene. And we know this because we've studied a lot of phone records. What are the two calls that are made? One's the 911. I give them credit. The other's to the company, safety department. All right? Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, I've seen many cases where the first call goes to the safety department, and then it goes to 911. Or it goes to 911, and that conversation is quite naturally pretty short, and then you've got a 10-minute conversation with someone at the safety department. Well, what does the safety department do? Yeah. Who do they send out there? They contact what's called their risk management. That's their insurance company, right? Or their third-party administrator. What does that person do? Contacts their defense lawyer. They've already got one in place. I mean, y'all know that, right? State Farm's got their own lawyers. Alpha's got their own lawyers. Lincoln General's got their own lawyers. They've all got their own lawyers. So they make the call, and then that lawyer's got an expert, and guess who's at the scene that day? They're there. That is an absolute guarantee that on the day of the wreck, the other side is going to be at the scene. Well, I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, everybody's got a right to investigate and defend or to know the truth about what happens. But see, here's the problem. I know a lot of us consider ourselves to be ethical, right? I mean, you'd like to think that in all situations I'm going to do the right thing, although I think we'd all recognize from time to time we don't do the right thing. Unfortunately, there are some companies, people out there who won't do the right thing. Look, there is nothing wrong with profit, right? I mean, I hope that we all try to be profitable. We're not going to be in law very long if we don't try to be profitable. Well, there's nothing wrong with companies or insurance companies being profitable too and wanting to be profitable. But think about this. How can they be more profitable by paying you more? They become more profitable by paying you less. And so when they send somebody out to the scene, many times it's for the purpose of, yes, trying to find out what happened, but also trying to find out how can we maximize our profit. Here's some language from a typical manual, okay? This is in a standard manual. Notify a member of management. Do not admit responsibility for anything. Do not admit to paying for anything. In the event of death or serious injury, do not make any statements until you talk to an attorney. If it's possible, get the other person to sign a driver exoneration card. You know what that is? That is I admit I'm at fault. So on one hand, you're supposed to call the attorney. on one hand, you're supposed to not say anything, but on the other hand, if you can get someone to say, it's my fault, then get them to say, it's my fault. That is typical statements in almost any kind of manual. This is hard to believe, that people will actually destroy evidence. Have you ever known anybody to do that? Seriously. I don't mean just let it disappear. I mean destroy. Now, I know, look, I've been accused of being like Oliver Stone so many times, and that's fine. I can deal with it. That, Matt, you always see the conspiracy. You always see the conspiracy. You always think that somebody's out there trying to do something to hurt your client. Well, as I was putting this presentation together last week, I got another example. All right? And I want to share this example with you. This is a typical case for us. I want you to pay close attention to this. This wreck happened up in North Alabama. And there was a defense lawyer up there who I'd worked with before. He called and said, I'd like for you to help my client out. So we get involved fairly soon after the wreck. They were badly injured. You can see the vehicle. Bad wreck. I send off the letter that Co talked to you about, the preservation of evidence letter. Well, the defense lawyer calls me up, different defense lawyer from Huntsville, and says, look, he said, look, we don't need to engage in any discovery in this case. Let's just you get us your medical records, and we'll see if we can get this thing settled. And I said, no, well, you know, before suit, your adjuster actually told my client it was her fault. So I don't see where that's going to lead anywhere. So how about we do discovery, and then we'll try to resolve the case if we can. In the meanwhile, you saw my preservation of evidence letter. I'd like to come up there with an expert, inspect the tractor, and download the black box, because we know how important that is. The top letter, and it gets a little confusing because we're dealing with two Matts here. Matt, we are happy to make it available, though there is no damage to the tractor, which is, I don't know how anybody can say that, nor is there any electronic data. I want you to notice the date, June 27th, 2012. There's no electronic data. John, we've heard that before, haven't we? Well, I said, you know what? I'm going to take my chance. I'm going to send up an expert. We'd like to download it just in case. You see, I had looked at the VIN number, and I knew that this particular tractor had a black box. It was a Detroit diesel engine, top of the line. It would have all the information on there about how the wreck happened. So expert goes up on July the 3rd. The inspection set for July the 3rd, last week. Well, something happened, John, between June 27th and July the 3rd. You know what happened? Evidence was destroyed. See these two here? Two hard-breaking events. Let me tell you what those are. Now, keep in mind, we've already asked them to preserve the data. Okay? A hard-breaking event, I've described it to you. A typical truck driver will have one hard-breaking event every 15 months. I mean, you got to think about that. It's not very often where somebody has to slam on the brakes in a tractor trailer to the point where you're standing up. But those data recorders only hold two hard-breaking events, which means usually it has data for about 3 years after the hard-breaking event. June 28th, day after we set up the inspection, hard-breaking event. July the 2nd, day before the inspection, another hard-breaking event. What do you think happened there? They rolled the data off for our wreck, which had happened just a short time before. Now keep in mind, we'd already asked them to preserve it. But not only did they not preserve it, but in that 5-day period, from the time we set up the inspection to the time the inspection was conducted, the data disappeared. Now, how do you reconcile that? For someone to say there's not any electronic data in an email, knowing this firm defends trucking cases all the time, and knowing they had the VIN number just like I did, and 5 days later the data disappears. You saw how important the data is. I guess that's just one example, John. I guess it just happened to be last week. I got another example that I could use in the seminar. Well, I'm going to talk about that in just a moment because we're about to have fun. All right? And I'm going to tell you specifically about a case. Now, I keep saying John, not my imaginary friend. It's John Jones in the back from Andalusia. Several of y'all know him. His wife, Amy. And the new circuit clerk to be, right? In Covington County. We'll talk about what can happen. This is one of the defense experts for the companies, okay? It just so happened to get some of the articles that he had written back when he lived a different life. He agrees data should be extracted as soon as possible to prevent destruction. Trucking company may allow a local truck dealer to extract the data. Sometimes people will deliberately hide the evidence or erase some of the trip data. All right. Okay, well, Matt, maybe not everybody destroys it. You know, there are times when people try to obstruct the finding of evidence. John, you recognize this. I'm going to answer your question, okay? John Jones represents a lot of folks in Covington County, Connecticut County, that area. John had represented a family. I hope you don't mind me talking about it, John, but it's too late now, right? The family comes to John and say, John, we've lost a loved one. And, you know, you got a good reputation. We'd like for you to take a look at it. I'm telling you, this is hard to believe. John calls me and says, I'd like to work with you on this. And so we hire an expert accident reconstructionist. You know, they're not cheap. They're definitely not cheap. I mean, you hire a good one, it may cost you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to come in and do an inspection. I'll go ahead and tell you that. We sent him out there. He says, look, all these skid marks, our client was going this way. There's no witnesses. Our client's going this way. Truck driver's coming this way. These are all skid marks the truck driver made. Impact happened right here outside the truck driver's line out of his lane. You see that? So our expert sits down with John and I and says, it looks like the trucker's speeding, just based upon the skid marks. He definitely wasn't in his vehicle or in his lane of travel at the time the impact occurred. But, you know, the trooper came out, our guy was dead. Trooper cited our guy because the truck driver said, he pulled out in front of me. There's no doubt about it. He pulled out in front from the stop sign, okay? Now, I'm going to show you a video clip from the deposition of their expert. So let me set this up. After that wreck happened, it was a huge company. They went through the process that I just told you. They contacted the insurance company. They contacted the defense lawyer. Defense lawyer went to the scene with an expert on the day of the fatality. They saw exactly what our expert had seen. Skid marks. Impact didn't happen in the lane of travel. I had an opportunity, John and I did, to take that expert's deposition. I want you to listen about what happened here. Oh, and not to mention there was a cautionary sign saying, slow down when you approach that intersection for the truck driver.
When you inspected the tractor on March the 4th, 2005,
I don't know what happened there. But let me tell you what he said. He said him and the defense lawyer went to the scene. And they knew that speed was an issue. I mean, who didn't? All those skid marks. And they looked over at the tractor, and the expert said, you know, that tractor has got a black box on it. They go over and they lift the hood, and sure enough, it's got one on there. They say, well, that sure would answer a lot of questions. Should we download it? This is the day of the wreck. The lawyer says, no, we don't need to download that. Well, what does that tell you? Now, you know, because of the data I just showed you, that 2 hard brake events later, or 300 engine hours, whichever comes first on many of these tractors, the evidence is going to disappear. So if they don't preserve the evidence, they haven't heard about any lawyer. It was months before somebody contacted John Jones. What good are they doing the company by downloading that data? The testimony was, well, look, when it comes to skid marks, let the plaintiff give them an expert. Let them come up with speed. But guess what we'll do? We'll get us an expert. Guess what our expert will say? He wasn't speeding. So then it's a battle of the experts. Plaintiff expert says speeding. Defense expert says not speeding. That's a tiebreaker right there. Look at them skid marks. We don't need to download that black box. And so they didn't. What's the remedy? In that case, we hadn't even got involved early enough to send out a preservation letter. Judge Hare in Connecticut County gave a spoliation of evidence charge. She heard the evidence from their expert. She heard the testimony about their defense lawyer. She heard the testimony about speed, and she instructed the jury that because of that, if they found that there was what was called spoliation of evidence, the jury could infer from that fact that they failed to preserve the evidence that the truck driver was speeding on the day of the wreck. Jury verdict in favor of the plaintiff. In that last case, not only do we have a preservation of evidence letter out, but we've got evidence that they actually took deliberate steps to remove the evidence. That is a very powerful jury charge. Very powerful jury charge. Oh no, there's no way they would destroy evidence. There's no way that people would obstruct evidence and also people out there that would falsify evidence. Now, I'm going to give you another example. I'm telling you this because my point is, look, when this case comes in, many times it comes in with the police report that says it's your client's fault. But you got to take quick and deliberate steps to preserve a case for your client. Let me show you this one, falsification of evidence. You figure out what happened there, right? It's just a matter of how many people died in that collision. This was a really bad wreck between Tuscaloosa and Birmingham a couple of years ago. Tractor trailer, passenger vehicle. There was a lane change. There was witnesses all over the board about what happened. Well, you know what happened. Truck driver called who? Company called who? Lawyer, expert, on the scene. Now, I'm not kidding. It's the same lawyer that we just talked about from the one that said that don't download the black box. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to identify him by name, but he handles, listen closely, he handles more trucking defense cases in Alabama than any other lawyer. His firm has over 50 lawyers. They've got a satellite office in Dothan, Alabama. They promote themselves as being aggressive in handling trucking defense. Same lawyer goes to the scene that day. He's down there with the insurance adjuster. He actually gets up in the cab of the truck, all right? Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But after he got up into the cab, the state trooper got up into the cab because there were a certain number of fatalities. The trooper had to do a certain kind of inspection, okay? One of the inspections that the trooper does is he gets in the cab to get the log books. Y'all have heard of those, right? We all request them. For the longest time, I didn't know what to do with them. I requested them. They just sat right there. Well, like a black box, they've got critical data that can help you determine whether a truck driver's over hours, whether they're driving too fast, whether they're doing their pre-trip inspection. Trooper gets up there and says, in the days leading up to the wreck, this driver did not fill out his logbooks. We filed the suit. It was in our standard request to produce the logbooks. There's a trooper said we couldn't find them. That's a trooper's notation. But when we filed the case and we sent out the discovery request, guess what we got? We got logbooks. Now, okay, fine. I sent them off to an expert. Expert calls me. Now, I had not told the expert that the trooper said that the logs didn't exist. All I sent this guy to Birmingham. I said, I want you to analyze these. He called me back. He said, something's not right. He said, Matt, he said, we've got ourselves the best truck driver that ever walked the earth. Now, forget the fact that he had a positive alcohol drug screen a few days before, but he is the best truck driver. I have never seen anybody who always drives the perfect speed, who always logs every entry, who always takes the right amount of time to do his pre-trip inspections. You've got yourself the best driver in the world. He said, I bet somebody's been whipping these logs. And I said, yeah, that makes sense to me. So I called up the lawyer and I said, look, we got an issue. Here's what Trooper says. You produce them. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, here's what my consulting expert says. I get an affidavit. It just showed up in the mail from the lawyer. Yeah, he got up in the tractor. That's how I found out. He got up in the tractor with the insurance adjuster. They got up in the tractor. Now, they're at the scene of a fatality. They're taking the bodies off the scene. You've got law enforcement around. They get up there, and guess what they do? I removed the log books and handed them to the attorney. Now, why would they do that? There's law enforcement around. Why in the world would they take the log books from the scene back to the defense lawyer's office? You know what the excuse was? Our driver was off at the hospital getting a toxicology report, a drug test. And he asked us to get in there and grab his toiletry items. And in the process of grabbing those, we accidentally grabbed the logbook. All right? They start looking around. They say, you know what, old Robert here, he's also used that somebody whipped out a gun on him that forced him off the road on 2 more wrecks. Oh, that's serious. Just send emails to the company about what happened. This is in the dawn of BlackBerries, and send an email. The lawyer and the adjuster email. We got good news. We got good news on this one. Wasn't Robert? We have determined that it was non-preventable. Well, there's a problem. The trooper starts hearing the story too, and he says, now wait. First off, we don't see any evidence that somebody ran him off the road. But say it was a Boyd Brothers box trailer. Yeah, it's definitely a box trailer. Boyd Brothers is a flatbed trailer. So how about we do this? How about we call up to Birmingham and just find out where all their trucks are with that. The company backed off. Yep, right here. We got the scuff mark. Because, those aren't uncommon on a trailer. And we also found some data, some wreck stuff that may indicate another vehicle was involved. Law enforcement pointed out there had been a wreck at the same spot a week before. Now, I'm not saying every judge lets that type of evidence come in. I mean, there is a battle there to figure out how does some of that evidence come into a case. But I will say in that particular case, a federal judge in the Birmingham, Tuscaloosa area let it in, and there was a substantial jury verdict. Now, I'm asking you, I completely acknowledge that not every person does this. Okay? But do you think it happens? Do you think it's just a coincidence that it happens on some of the cases that I work on? I can tell you that in most cases that I work on, this happens to some degree. Sometimes it's not as blatant. Sometimes it's not as destructive. Sometimes it's not as obvious. But here's what I've concluded. If the company is out there to maximize profit, and the way to do that is to deny claims, and the way to deny or minimize claims is to find evidence, manipulate evidence, get rid of evidence, guess what? It happens. I want to leave you with this example because I've just finally got to the point, and I hate to say it, but with a lot of people, you just can't take them at their word. When I was in law school, I remember Ken Randall, the dean of the law school, stood up. I think he said it during orientation, then I know he said it before we graduated. He said, look, y'all have all been called to a profession. Maybe your parents called it for you, but you've all been called to a profession. And the system that we're in large part, requires that lawyers, of course, be advocates, zealous advocates. But it also requires that we all be honest. And he challenged every person in the class to be as honest as you can in the representation that you have of people. Here's another instance, okay? And this is another one that's very familiar. It happened here in South Alabama. Happened in one of the neighboring counties right here. And it happened with another firm that primarily deals trucking defense cases. Y'all know what happened. Fatality. Somebody ran a red light. No eyewitnesses that could really be relied upon. One was very sick and had a different account of how the wreck happened. Lawyer comes to the scene with an expert, with representative, with investigator. Y'all know what they do. They actually download the black box. All you got to do is plug a little laptop in. Y'all know how easy that is? They take a laptop to the scene. They'd probably take the iPads now. Take it to the scene. They up within 2 seconds. Down. Man, how hard is that? A typical trucking defense case, you know how much it costs to prosecute it? $40,000 to $60,000. Do you know how much it costs to defend it? $100,000 to $150,000 in a death case. How long and how much would it cost to download a black box? You're at the scene. Just plug up your iPad. Plug up your computer. $200. $200. They get all the evidence they want on that black box. And so what do? They come out there, and if it's good for them, guess what you get? Look at the black box data. If you don't get it, you know something's up. Well, in this case, they downloaded it. We asked for it. We knew how critical it was. Now, this truck didn't have one. Now, come on. You got to be kidding me. It's got one, right? Now, this is back in the days when I didn't know how to look at the VIN numbers and have somebody look at the VIN numbers and decode them and figure out what kind of engine and all that. No, it didn't have one. Well, put it in writing. Put it in. Okay, put it in writing. Put it under oath. Who do you want to sign it? You want me to sign it? I'll sign it. We don't have one. Another case with Amy and John. I think Amy did all the good work on this one. They started looking through photographs. And do y'all know how monotonous it is to look through photographs? There's some great troopers out there, and some of them like to take pictures. Some of them really like to take pictures. This one here, the trooper got up in a bucket truck and started taking pictures. I'd never seen so many pictures from one wreck. But it was a fatality. It was serious. There were probably 500 pictures. And they all looked the same. They'd say, okay, I'll look at them. No, John, Amy, one of them studied the pictures. Then an expert got involved and said, whoa, we got one. Yep. Looks like we got a busted windshield and the inside of a cab. Next picture. No, look at this. See this little yellow device here? There's a screen above it. Well, I thought they had satellite radio or something. You know what that is? It's a connection to the black box. And guess what it's doing? It's pumping information into the cab. It's telling the truck driver exactly how many hours he's been, how his RPMs have been over the last hour, the speed that he was trying. I said, you got to be kidding. This can't be from the same wreck. I've got 3 signed interrogatory responses and a letter from the lawyer saying, the truck doesn't have one. I said, y'all mixed in another picture. There's no way, John and Amy. Well, let's find out where the tractor was purchased. So we did. Guess what? They're right. It had one on there. Not only was it on there, the company had spent extra money to get it. It was an upgrade. It was the top of the line. I said, well, come on now, but how good of that could that data have been for us in this wreck? You remember the data that showed the RPMs? Somebody flooring it to beat a light? This one was even better than that. It provided some of the most high-tech data that I could see, but unfortunately, it was gone. Well, not really. Turns out, when we started taking the company's deposition, the company said, oh, what do you mean? We've got a black box on there. Who's been telling you we don't have a black box? Robert, we gave you that data. It's in your office. Robert was the lawyer. Robert didn't show up at that deposition. Robert must have known something was going to happen. We didn't see a whole lot of Robert from that point forward. Well, we got the reports, but it was missing the one from the wreck. Anybody know Judge McCaffin in Covington County? That was a trial in front of Judge McCaffin. It resolved itself before a jury verdict, but John, I believe the judge had indicated there was going to be a spoliation of evidence charge from the very beginning of the trial. Here's what I want you to think about. In those days after someone comes into your office, You just got to realize that the other side is working. And there's nothing wrong with that. But unfortunately, not only are some of them working, but some of them are working to falsify, obstruct, and destroy. And the downside is that clients have entrusted us to represent them, and that is a huge honor. You know, sometimes I forget that there were a whole bunch of lawyers that they could have hired besides me. And yeah, I've got other cases, but they don't. They have entrusted their case with me. If I let this go unchecked, what have I done for my client? Essentially, in many ways, I've put my client in a position where they cannot win. But now, Aaron's going to tell you in a few minutes that you can not only have an appreciation of what happens, but you can find out what happens. And let me tell you, Judge McCathan, pretty conservative. Judge Hare, pretty conservative. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, that federal judge, very conservative. But you know what all of those judges did when they were confronted with the facts about what really happened? I'm not going to say they were outraged because I don't know what their personal opinion was. But they followed the law, and they said, in this case, we're going to allow the plaintiff and the injured person to go to the jury with a spoliation of evidence charge. Now, what it tells me is they're still doing it. They were doing it as of recently as last week. Which, you know what that means? It's working. As many times as John or Amy may catch them, or Jim Jacobs may catch them, or Aaron Gartlan may catch them, or Co Baxter may catch them, there's a lot of times they're not being caught. And so I hope that you all will look at the materials, at least be aware, if you're not, that this is going on, so that you can be equipped to take it on with some of the techniques that Aaron will be talking to you about. Any questions? And y'all know y'all can get up and get something to eat anytime. So, but Aaron's going to speak next. Thank y'all.